Follow the Dead Prussian podcast on Twitter at Dead Prussian Pod and Facebook at facebook.com/thedeadprussian. The Dead Prussian podcast is hosted and produced by Mick Cook. The Dead Prussian podcast is copyright of Mick Cook.
You hear a lot about the narrative, countering the narrative, competing narratives, who's telling what. In fact, even new influencers these days have their own designed, manicured narrative. What are strategic narratives? What are narratives revolving around warfare? And how do they help us understand war? G'day listeners, and welcome back to the Dead Prussian podcast, the best podcast named after a 19th century Prussian military thinker. I'm your host, Mick, and I would like to thank you all for the welcome back we've had in 2024. It's been great to come back and provide you with some more content, not just to our premium subscribers who have been getting a whole heap of narratives around battles, but also all our listeners who are back for the freebie season of 2024, the main season. In fact, it's the main content we like to provide. I'd also like to thank those listeners who've been supporting our other productions on Rome and also some of the premium content with that, Enemies of Rome, as well as the newly released TDP Battles. Now, I'm pre-recording this episode in 2023, so now that I've said that, I have to release the TDP Presents Battles, so you'll also be listening to the Battles series as well. If you are a premium subscriber on the Dead Prussian, you get those episodes months in advance of anyone else. If you are a free subscriber, and that means you don't want to pay for your podcast, that's okay. If you just jump over on your app to Battles, you'll find us, and Daniel will take you through some of history's most famous battles. Now, today, ladies and gents, we're going to talk about strategic narratives and warfare. I was reading the Air Force University, United States Air Force University professional journal, their premier journal, Ether, as you do, just flicking through it. And I don't have hard copies of it, unfortunately. I was just flicking through the web, and I saw an article that grabbed my attention, and it was on strategic narratives. Now, being a strategic communication consultant, I thought that was fantastic. I had a read, and then I reached out to the author. So that's the danger of these publications. They make people like me become stalkers. But what I want to talk about is strategic narratives. Now, I have my bent in my professional sphere, but I wanted to find out from an expert how it relates to war and warfare. So I got one. My guest today is Lieutenant Colonel Sean Nick Blas. He's a career intelligence officer in the United States Air Force with 18 years of service. He has deployed 6 times in operations in Iraq and Afghanistan, and he has a PhD in international relations and comparative politics from the University of Utah. He's currently an assistant professor at the Air Command and Staff College and the director of instruction for the Joint All-Domain Strategist Concentration. Lieutenant Colonel Blas's research focuses on strategic narratives and information warfare, exactly what we're looking for. And I think I did really, really well to say Lieutenant Colonel instead of Lieutenant Colonel because I'm an Australian, so I think we need a round of applause for that too, ladies and gentlemen. Nick, thank you very much for coming on the show.
Thank you, Mick. I appreciate being on it.
Now, Nick, it's interesting always talking to a military person, currently serving military person who is also a scholar, but given that you're a currently serving military person, I'm assuming what I'm going to get today is your opinions?
Yeah. As a matter of fact, I should read this and start off our conversation with the obligatory statement. All my comments are my own and do not reflect the opinions or policies of the Department of Defense, the United States Air Force, nor the Air Command and Staff College where I'm currently serving.
Awesome.
So with that being said, that's all my thoughts are open to you.
Excellent. That is awesome. And as someone who's been on both sides of the fence responding to media comments or providing media commentary, I truly appreciate that. And to be honest, that's me and the listeners, are more interested in your opinions than we are in that of the United States Air Force at the moment, because we could just call them up and get a spokesman's comment if we needed to. But, Nick, my first question is around what motivated you to become a scholar on strategic narratives and war. So what was the motivation?
Yeah, my progression to the study of strategic narratives was kind of natural over time. Early in my career as an intelligence analyst, I had a great mentor that taught me to think about capability, opportunity, and intent when assessing risk for senior leaders. Now, capability and opportunity, while not necessarily easy to ascertain, are somewhat clear cut. When you think about capability, you're looking at the technical capability of your adversary. What weapon systems do they have? How well are they trained on it? Do they know how to employ it properly? Opportunity becomes a little bit more difficult as you think about you have to understand what you are doing operationally, where your forces are arrayed, and how that looks in connection to the adversary at the time, right? However, getting into intent is much more difficult and requires a deeper understanding of the subject. Because of this, I became more interested in learning about cultures and alternative thoughts to how I might view a situation. I specifically studied a lot about the Middle East and Eastern Europe, and I became enamored with many of their cultural stories. In particular, there's one wonderful example that takes place in both Turkey and Bulgaria. There's this children's story in both of these countries that have two distinct heroes. In Turkey, the hero's name is Nostradam Hoca, and as a matter of fact, the golf course at Incirlik Air Force Base is named after him. And then in Bulgaria, the character or the hero is Hitar Peter. Hitar means like wise or wily or crafty, right? And what's interesting is that I started reading both of these stories independently, and each of them go on their separate adventures. But what you see is that the stories actually crossed over at a certain period of time, and they started competing against each other. Nostradam Hoca would try and do something, and Hita Petter would try to challenge that, and they would go back and forth. And what I thought was fascinating was how this kind of reflected the reality of what was going on during this Ottoman Empire as these stories were coming about, right? And so stories kind of reflected the realities of the current time. So I really became interested in stories at that point. Now, fast forward to my graduate studies, I wanted to bring the same richness and perspective to the studies of international relations and security studies. So as I started looking at cases and thinking about things, I happened to start all of this in December of 2010, and that was right when the Arab Spring kicked off. And as I looked at this, pundits and analysts and world leaders alike could never have anticipated the political and social upheaval that was about to unfold. The Arab Spring brought change with such speed and sheer magnitude that it called into question many of the preconceived notions of the strength of these old guard regimes in the Middle East and North Africa. From the start, these governments lost their monopolies on the control of information, and internet-savvy youth promoted their message via social media. This flow of information enabled groups with long-standing disputes with each other to set aside those differences and coalesce behind a common platform. You saw Islamists working with feminist movements. You saw soccer hooligans who were meeting with street organizers. All of these groups came together, and it really became this story that wasn't about their own independent ideas, and really the story of, whatever it is, it's not going to be them, right? We're not going to allow the government to dictate this. And that's where you really saw change, is once the storylines coalesced and there was a single narrative that moved forward, you saw this social mobilization. However, what fascinated me was that I don't think that this went unnoticed. And I think you saw an explosion of kind of this idea of information warfare across the spectrum. In February 2013, General Vasily Gerasimov, the Russian chief of the general staff, who's comparable to the U.S. chairman of Joint Chief of Staffs, published a 2,000-word article, and it's honestly kind of a lame title. The value of science is in the foresight. However, this article has since grown, and now what we have is this idea of the Gerasimov doctrine, right? How do you use information to disrupt your adversary? And we've seen this expanded across the globe. You have China, who has the three warfare strategy, and there's several other countries that are using information in various ways. And so that's where my fascination to strategic narratives came, and why I'm interested in studying strategic narratives and warfare.
I remember the Arab Spring quite clearly because I was in the middle of Afghanistan at the time, and pretty frustrated as an Arabic linguist being in Central Asia because I was pretty useless with translating. Pashto and Dari, because they were completely different, right? And so watching the Arab Spring, having spent some time in Egypt, both a professional and personal interest and how it was going. And then I went straight into a posting on information operations afterwards. So the time period you're talking about was key for me as an individual. In fact, it probably helped lead to the motivations to start this podcast. So I'm sorry, listeners, that's how this happened. But I'm really interested in, you talked about some interesting elements there, some folk tales, and then you also talked about the Arab Spring, and then also how institutionalised information warfare has become and how it's been implemented in some nations. Now, how do strategic narratives intersect with and influence traditional military strategies? What are the key challenges in effectively integrating these narratives into military operations?
Yeah. So first, I think it might be good to just give a kind of a quick overview of what are strategic narratives. And I don't want to go into a whole bunch of the academic definitions of this. I think we can look at strategic narratives in the purest sense as storylines. So if you think about this, they follow this pattern of plots, subjects, and conclusions, right? So plots set the context for what is going on. And typically, as human beings, we draw from the past to understand the present, right? So if you think about 9/11 and some of the communications and the conversations that were going on to understand what was happening in 9/11 in the United States, the story of Pearl Harbor was used quite a bit. So we understood 9/11 through what occurred in the past, right? And we used that to develop this plot of what was going on. Subjects, a little bit different. It brings the context into the present. But what we like to do with subjects is we like to create very clear dichotomies. As humans, we like to understand the good guys and the bad guys, and we want to be the good guys, and we want to understand the bad guys is doing something evil or unjust, right? And then finally, when you think about the conclusion for me is probably the most important aspect, because the conclusion develops this future goal or orientation. So if you think of national objectives or military objectives, they always have the conclusion in mind, right? So when you're doing planning, that's always in your forefront. You want to create a better environment that you left behind ultimately. That's what you try to achieve, right? So let's set that aside for just a second, and now let's think about military strategy. Now, there's several ways we could explain and understand military strategy depending on where we are situated in the strategic, operational, or tactical context. Regardless of the myriad of nuanced answers, I think a core aspect is that strategy is a schematic that connects means to ends in a logical and achievable fashion. Specifically, when we consider operational design in the development of military strategy, we should understand it as a process of framing and managing the underlying political problems that necessitate the application of military means, right? So now finally kind of putting this together, right? We'll put the two things together. I argue that modern warfare necessitates military strategy be nested in a nation's strategic narratives to effectively translate the application of force into national objectives. Inherently, strategists reach for strategic narratives as they operationally design military action to affect the battle space in a way that achieves national and military end states. So we have to translate force even more so today. If we think about war in the industrial age, I think there's a misnomer there, but there's this idea that when the shooting starts, you have to talk less, right? As we're fighting, we don't need to talk as much. However, I think in the information age, as more force is applied, it becomes requisite that we communicate more and explain what is happening, both to our populations, our domestic populations, as well as to our adversaries and to the world in general. Now, with that being said, I think a key challenge with all of this is that we need to recognize that strategic narratives are never singular. They exist in a highly contested environment that is constantly evolving. And as you look at this, the military strategist needs to have a sense of this evolving environment as they try to think about strategic narratives and what they are doing in the moment with their plans.
I really enjoy the discussion around what are strategic narratives and how to apply it. And once the shooting war starts, the talking war's over. I guess it depends on what you're talking. Like I used to, remind my commanders that if they're about to go into a certain town or village with force tomorrow, asking me to tell people to get out today is probably a bit late. But it doesn't mean we can't still talk to them and tell them things like stay in your homes. But at a broader scale, it also becomes more important. Now, I remember later when I was working at a university, we were talking about narratives, and we were trying to explain how we were using a simulation to help plot narrative trajectories and hopefully use it to predict narrative trajectories of potential adversaries or just competitors, not necessarily in an adversarial, but more of a competition space as opposed to conflict, so pre-conflict. And for the visualization, we tried using the simulation results and trajectories. It was a little bit difficult, and the one thing we realised was no one could relate to the stories because we'd been running the simulation before the military visitors had got there, so they didn't even understand the strategic context. They couldn't understand the strategic narrative, and therefore looking at the narrative trajectories and understanding where they could insert their own information operations didn't really make sense. So we modelled, we didn't model, actually we found an article where someone had modelled the very first Star Wars film, A New Hope. And we used that as an example of how you could visualise a narrative trajectory for each of the characters and sides, the rebels and the Empire in there. And they understood it. And they almost understood it intuitively because they're familiar with the narrative, right? So when people become familiar with the strategic narratives, it becomes less of, I suppose, the strat comms or the IO of staff officers trying to convince someone, hey, this is important stuff. When people are living it, it starts to become a natural thing. So I guess...
Yeah, I think it's important that we don't overcomplicate it. I love the story that you gave there because I think our understanding of strategic narratives needs to be digestible and easily applied in military strategy and planning. So that's great. I love that.
Now, I mean, I wouldn't use Star Wars for everything, but I try and use it for as much as I
Fair
can.
enough.
I definitely try and use it for as much as I can. And to be honest, to get there, I went through some horrible designs. But luckily we found that paper, but which I probably for the life of me wouldn't be able to find today. But in your work, you discuss the importance of strategic narratives in shaping public and political understanding of military actions, right? Which I think is important, particularly given that both of our nations just went through 20 plus years of fighting some wars that we didn't necessarily do so well in, and they weren't mobilising the entire nations, so the understanding of the public and political elements of the war weren't really great. They weren't the same as what they were in, say, a conflict like Vietnam, where both nations had conscription, or they weren't the same in the Second World War, where society was 100% geared towards winning it. So can you provide an example of how this played out in recent military conflict and its impact on the conflict's outcome?
Yeah. Let me start by just saying that I actually don't think any of my arguments are radically new. And I say this for one very important reason. And that's because I want to identify that these narratives and strategic narratives have existed for a long time. As a matter of fact, some of my interest in strategic narratives actually came from Karl von Clausewitz as we looked at the paradoxical trinity, right? And usually once I start talking about Clausewitz, my middle grade officers that I teach at Air Command and Staff College usually give me a big groan and kind of roll their eyes. But I think there's some important ideas here, right? You know, as we look at that trinity and we think about government, the people, and the military, there's a need to understand how they're connected. And for me, strategic narratives have been and still are the connective tissue between them, right? So just two examples that I'll use here. One is a very salient one from U.S. history, and that's Vietnam, right? In Vietnam, a very unpopular war. There were already a lot of contested narratives going on. You had the political narratives of why we were there. You had the domestic pushback against that. And then you had the military kind of stuck in between. However, building up to 1968, the military narrative kind of identified this concept or this conclusion that we were winning, right? We were making progress and we were winning. However, in January 1968, with the launching of the Tet Offensive, things changed. Now, from a military perspective, this was actually very advantageous to the United States, right? For once, they didn't have to fight a guerrilla war that they weren't necessarily designed to fight. The enemy came out in the open, and we had a lot of military and operational success there. However, what was really interesting was how it was narrated. And in particular, if you think back to the news broadcast of Walter Cronkite, he said something that was very important here, and I'll quote it. For it seems now more certain than ever that the bloody experience of Vietnam is to end in a stalemate. This shatters the strategic narrative that the military strategy was wrapped around. Nobody wanted to fight a protracted war to a stalemate. Everybody thought we were going to get to this altruistic conclusion. And so once that was shattered for the American people, the support for the war crumbled exponentially. So strategic narratives to ensure legitimacy for action becomes very, very important. Now, let's take a more recent example. I think the Russia-Ukraine war is actually a really good example here. And in some cases is a good example of the bad use of strategic narratives. Going into Ukraine, Russia developed these narratives that they were going in there to liberate the Ukrainian people, that they were going to expel Nazis, that they were going to free everybody, and things were going to be better. But once they got in there, the story that was on the ground was very different, right? There's some great YouTube videos, one in particular that I oftentimes show to my students, and that's where there's a Baba, a grandmother, that's talking to a Russian soldier, and she essentially says, put these sunflower seeds in your pocket because when you die, you can grow some flowers. What are you coming here? You're not liberating me, you're invading me, right? And so this is where the narratives can clash. So understanding that dynamic becomes very important. And in particular, one of the cautionary notes that I often give is that strategic narratives can't just be lies, right? You can't just lie because people will know, especially in the information age now. So I think that becomes very important and becomes two very good examples that we can play off of in the future as we look to where strategic narratives fit into military strategy.
Yeah, that story of the Ukrainian grandmother certainly spread. You saw the operationalisation of both information machines from both sides of the current conflict in Ukraine spin up, and the question I've always asked, that's such a good story. How close was it to the truth? Because good stories, as you talked about, false narratives or lying don't necessarily cut the mustard anymore with modern audiences, unless you're in marketing, because people would just buy anything. But you do need to embed a lot of these stories with truth, right? You need to be able to provide something that can genuinely be connected back to a believable story or situation. And that one's just one that was like, wow, that's pretty good. I think the sunflowers and the Russian soldier are probably the closest, most accurate things. But hey, it's a great story. Now, we're on to our last question on topic before our premium question. So this one's more of an operational question for those listeners who have a military or a public policy background or just an interest in history. But this one's considering the significance of information warfare and how should military strategists and planners, the people who you teach, adapt their approach to ensure that strategic narratives are effectively utilised in both lethal and non-lethal aspects of warfare.
Yeah, I think one of the first things is that we need to have a better consideration of strategic narratives at the forefront in the planning process. It can't be just a secondary thought that gets thrown in there, or it really just doesn't work. Right. So throughout the planning process, I think we need to think through strategic narratives. What is our strategic narrative that we're trying to achieve, and how does that work with our strategy? And there's kind of three cuts that I usually give on applying or understanding strategic narratives within that planning realm, right? Number one is understanding and shaping the environment, right? So strategic narratives can help us to understand the environment that we're going into, but also there's an element of shaping the environment with information as we look to execute operations. I think that becomes very important. The other is that throughout the planning, we need to think about maintaining legitimacy, right? As we do the planning process, we teach our students, okay, you come up with a course of action, right? And that course of action leads to your military end state and your national security end states. However, we identify the need for branch plans and sequels in case things don't go quite right. Very similarly, we need to understand strategic narratives in that way as well, in order to try and constantly think about how do we maintain legitimacy for what we are doing here. And the third point is the translation of the use of force. Again, I think in today's environment, as we start shooting, that shooting needs to actually be translated. You can't just drop a bomb and expect either your adversary or anybody to understand it. We need to understand what we are doing and why we are doing it, and that message has to be communicated. So information and public affairs and intelligence and all of those information environment pieces have to start to be pulled together in our military planning processes.
Now, I would love to go into discussion on how we integrate these into military planning processes, but that's a completely different episode. We don't have time for that, but it is something that I think is key for people's understanding. You need to get in the training schools really early on, right? Because by the time someone, say, a field rank, say like a major rank, it's really tough then to start changing how they view these. But when you start teaching it to some of the younger ranks, they intuitively get it, because particularly these days, because they live a lot and they deal with a lot of stuff being thrown at them. I mean, we all do. It's just us older folk are a bit slower in keeping up with it. Now, Nick, we do owe something to our premium subscribers. They provide a much needed source of revenue to help keep the show on the servers. So what we'll do now is we'll have a quick pause so that we can go to a premium subscriber question. I'll ask an amazing question and you will give a brilliant answer. And for those listeners that aren't premium subscribers, there will be an ad played here. We do advertise on the show now so that we can keep the servers going. Now, if you don't appreciate that, I don't apologise, because you guys made this show a success to the point where I need to keep paying the bills. So if you hadn't been listeners, then I wouldn't have had to have put ads in there. But we'll only be a short ad, and then we'll be right back with Nick's answer to the final question. So a quick pause. And now we're back with all of our listeners, all under one tent, one big happy family again. And thank you very much to our guest, Nick, for your premium subscriber answer. That was wonderful. And I also thank all our guests for listening to an ad if you did not listen to the premium subscriber question. As I said to our premium subscribers, it's not all about money on the show, but it helps keep us on the airways, because as you know, with the cost of living crisis around the globe at the moment, it costs money to do things. Literally breathing these days pretty much costs you money. So, Nick, we'll go to a better topic, something more enlightening, something less depressing than money. Let's talk about war. And what we will talk about when it comes to war is its definition. The way Carl continued to discuss war in his book, we try and continue that conversation about war. War is something that Carl tried to wrestle with throughout his book. He didn't provide one explanation, although some of my very earlier guests thought that was the DS answer. There is no DS answer, and for listeners who don't know what I mean by DS, it means directing staff. That's what Nick is. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we've had some very interesting answers to this over the time, but every guest has to do it because it's kind of the butcher's bill, I like to say, for coming on the show. So, Nick, in the tradition of Carl wrestling with understanding what war is, can you please finish the sentence? War is.
So in a true pithy Carl way, war is a story written by two sides at the same time, each trying to overlay their own strategic narrative on the other.
Excellent. That's good. And I like that some of their narrative tools, if we expanded that, we could talk about not all their narrative tools are written form. Some of their narrative tools are not non-lethal. Some of them are very lethal. So I really like that definition, Nick, because one, it's short, and sometimes we have trouble with guests not keeping them short. You know who you are. And this one means that you've put a lot of thought into it, which is brilliant. So, Nick, thank you very much for coming on the show and talking with us about strategic narratives and warfare.
Thank you, Mick. I appreciate it.
Ladies and gentlemen, thanks again for all your support for the show. 2024 season has been an absolute cracker already, and I say this pre-recording in 2023, so I'm assuming that it's been an absolute cracker, but based on some of our previews and some of our previews, we haven't really done much advertising. We don't do too much advertising ahead of a season, but the reactions that have been provided on social media so far about the upcoming season have been absolutely fantastic. So I'm assuming the season's going quite well as you're listening to this, and appreciate both our free and premium subscribers. You're both very, very important to us. Without the free subscribers, we wouldn't have a show. So if you are someone who just can't afford to be a premium subscriber or don't want to be a premium subscriber, absolutely no problem, because without you, we still wouldn't have a show. I need an audience to be able to provide this content, and the reason I provide this content is because I think discussions around war need to continue and talk about the relationship society has with war. I'm not pro-war. I'm just someone who's been through it and thinks we need to talk about it a lot more before we go to it. Now, if you enjoyed the discussion with Nick tonight, whenever you're listening to it, please check out his article. It's in the US Air Force University Professional Journey. It's a strategic, I'll get the proper title for it. It's called Ether, a Journal of Strategic Air Power and Space Power, and is in volume 2, number 1. It has its own website, and you can click on it in the show notes. And it's in the spring edition of 2023, and it's on pages 46 to 57. And it's only 12 pages long. So you can tell that I've read it, because I wouldn't know that if I didn't read it. But also, we wouldn't have had Nick on the show if I didn't read it. So make sure you get along and have a read of that. It's free. You can access it for free. So just jump on there, completely open access, and you can really delve into some of the topics that Nick talked about today. Please check out our other shows on Rome. Most importantly is a new show on a different topic, similar format. It's me talking. So please check that out and let us know what you think. And we talk about the legacy of ancient Rome and some of the stories that you may not necessarily have heard before, or the stories you've heard before, but maybe with a little bit more rigour, academic detail. We have quite a few archaeologists on the show naturally. So you hear a little bit more about the way the stories unfolded in that is not so much a pop culture sense. We also have military historians on there as well, who are experts, and people who have been in the military as well. So when we talk about ancient Roman battles and how the battle unfolded, we actually have people who have also fought in wars and understand terrain. So it's quite interesting hearing their perspectives, a modern soldier's perspective on an ancient battle. It's quite interesting. And we also have some of our more narrative style shows coming out. TDP Battles, which is the most prolific one at the moment. You get the premium content here on this show, but you can also get the free content if you subscribe to that show's own channel and listen to that. And we also may be having a narrative podcast on supporting on Rome coming out called Enemies of Rome. That is currently premium content for the On Rome show, but we might bring that out as a separate one after a while so that all of our listeners can get it. So the premium subscribers to that show will be getting it early, but everyone else might be getting it a month or two later. So lots happening here. So if you like our shows, and if you like my voice, go to the interview style shows. If you don't like my voice, go to the other ones. We have some great hosts reading those other shows. But until next time, listeners, grab a book and crack on.
Follow the Dead Prussian podcast on Twitter at Dead Prussian Pod and Facebook at facebook.com/thedeadprussian. The Dead Prussian podcast is hosted and produced by Mick Cook. The Dead Prussian podcast is copyright of Mick Cook.